Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Late afternoon light filtered across the Apache border camp in scattered patches, as if dust, smoke, and the day's heat had left fingerprints in the air. The ground held footprints, old ashes, and fragments from barter: horsehair rope, broken bits of pottery, frayed saddle straps. Men traded over blankets spread out on the dirt, their voices rising and falling like the tired rhythm of a river. But nothing in that place felt settled. At the center of the camp, tied to a rough wooden post, stood Trace Morvan. His wrists were bound behind him, the rope biting into his skin, and every so often he had to shift to keep his hands from going numb. Sweat clung to his dust-caked face, and dried blood stained his left jaw, where one of the renegades had struck him earlier. He kept his breathing slow, partly to manage the pain, partly because panic would only make them break him faster. His thoughts moved slowly, sharply, like a man who's run out of options. Just that morning, he'd been herding cattle alone, aiming to reach a pasture before nightfall. His goal had been simple: deliver the herd, collect his pay, and move on without leaving roots behind. But trouble had found him anyway. They ambushed him near a dry creek bed, dragged him off his horse without a word, and hauled him here. Now he was stuck in a camp that didn't care whether he lived or died, waiting to be traded for whatever scrap these men thought worth the deal. He tried to stay alert, but every hour tied up made it harder. His ribs were bruised, and every breath hurt. He watched the people around him, measured distances, read their faces and posture. None of the options looked good. Not far away, between two worn-down shelters, an Apache woman watched from the shade of a twisted tree. One arm was tucked close to her chest, hiding bruises beneath a torn leather top. Her skirt was caked in dried mud and thorns. It looked like she'd been running for days. Her hair hung long and uneven, falling messily over her shoulders. Her name was Tiva Munai, 24 years old. She had reached the camp just hours before Trace, walking with the quiet alertness of someone who had been hunted. Another group had accused her of a raid she didn't commit, and she'd fled with barely anything. All she wanted now was to vanish, find shelter, keep her head down. Survival, for now, was her only plan. She tried to avoid the crowd, but her eyes kept returning to the man at the post. From afar, she studied how he kept silent, how he moved only when he had to. She noticed how he held his breath to spare his ribs, how he tried to shift his weight without drawing attention. Tiny details, but enough to tell her he wasn't reckless. He was someone with discipline, with control, a man who could endure far more than most would in his place. And there, in that quiet act, Tiva felt something she hadn't in days. A pressure in her chest, small but sharp, like something telling her this man wasn't like the ones who had chased her through the canyon. She didn't trust anyone. Not now. But he didn't look at her with scorn or cruelty. And in this place, that meant something. That meant everything. When Daxon Creed, the renegade trader, stepped toward Trace Morvan and announced the bidding was about to begin, Tiva Munai watched his every move. The men gathered, smirking like it was a game. The first offer came from Brig Nolan, a tall man who raised a worn saddle blanket. The second came from Rhodes Kellen, shaking a chipped metal bowl. None of it was serious. They were mocking him. They didn't see a man tied to a post. They saw an excuse to laugh. Trace clenched his jaw. He didn't lift his head. Let the laughter roll over him like dust on the wind. He couldn't fight, couldn't run, couldn't bargain. So he focused on breathing slow, bearing the pain, and keeping his mind sharp. At that moment, Tiva's pulse shifted. Something tightened in her chest. A tense, uncomfortable pressure. She had spent her life making choices forced by others. But this time, the choice was hers. She stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the center of camp. The air changed immediately. Voices hushed. Heads turned. She reached into the small woven pouch hidden beneath her skirt. Inside were the last remnants of her former life. A beaded necklace she'd worn since she was a child, a small knife with a carved bone handle, and the embroidered bracelet her mother, Noma Corin, had given her before she died. Losing them would mean cutting the final thread to her past. But keeping them wouldn't save her. Keeping them wouldn't offer protection. Keeping them wouldn't give her someone to trust. She took one step closer to Daxon Creed. The whole camp watched. "Let him go," she said, voice firm, though worn by days without rest. "He's leaving with me." The silence that followed wasn't respect. It was shock. Daxon Creed narrowed his eyes, weighing whether the woman had anything of value. When he saw the bracelet, its fine stitching, the careful handiwork, he gave a slow nod. He didn't argue, didn't question her decision. He turned toward Trace. Two men sliced the rope from the post. Trace's wrists dropped forward, and blood rushed back in with a sharp burn. The renegades shoved him, but Tiva stepped in immediately. She didn't touch him, but her body shielded his. Her stance made it clear. She would allow no more harm. Trace looked at her, for the second time that day. Confusion tensed his shoulders. He didn't know what she wanted, why she'd give up everything for a stranger, or whether this new situation was better or worse. Tiva didn't give him time to think. "Come," she said quietly. He hesitated just a breath, long enough for fear and instinct to pull in opposite directions. Running didn't make sense. Staying in the camp made even less. She was the only one who had shown any intent to protect him. He chose to follow her. Tiva led him beyond the camp and into the trees. She'd set up a small shelter earlier, covered in animal hides, barely big enough for two to sit. They entered. The air inside was cold and still. She knelt and lit a small fire with trembling hands. She no longer hid her exhaustion. Her arms trembled. Her breath came short. Trace sat across from her. His ribs ached. His wrists burned, but his voice stayed steady. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Tiva didn't look up. She nudged a dry branch into the fire. "I needed someone," she answered plainly. "You were alone too." Trace let the words sink in slowly. She wasn't asking for help. She wasn't demanding anything. She was explaining her choice, with no apology. The firelight revealed the wear on her face. It also showed fear, mixed with something quieter, the hope of safety, or at least the hope of trying. When she finally raised her eyes, her voice was softer. "Now you stay with me," she said. "You'll be my husband." Trace Morvan didn't move, didn't speak at once. His mind ran through every angle. Danger, risk, uncertainty, survival. He looked at the bruises on Tiva Mooneye, at her empty pouch, her tired face, and the quiet strength she was trying to hold on to. Her words hadn't sounded like a command. They sounded like a plea born of exhaustion and of having no other road left. He didn't answer yet, but he didn't get up to leave either, and that, in itself, already meant something. Tiva lowered her gaze to the fire. The tension in her shoulders eased just slightly. In the silence that followed, the two of them tried to make sense of each other. Why they were here, what they needed, and whether trusting a stranger made more sense than continuing to distrust every face they'd come across in recent months. Outside, the noise of the camp was fading as the cold crept in. Inside, A wounded cowboy and a hunted Apache woman sat face to face, sharing a small shelter. Both tired. Both uncertain. Both aware that their lives had just changed, even if they didn't yet understand how. Their story began in that quiet space. Two people with nothing more than the decision to stay seated, to breathe, and to hope the other wouldn't pull away. By morning, light crept through a small gap in the hide-covered roof. Trace opened his eyes to the sound of Tiva moving near the fire. She was kneeling, adding twigs one by one, her motions slow and quiet, avoiding any unnecessary noise. Her body held the stiffness of someone who hadn't slept deeply, or for very long. Trace felt the same. His shoulders were heavy. His ribs ached. The night had been a mix of shallow sleep and alert listening. He sat up slowly, feeling the pull in his side. Tiva glanced at him from the corner of her eye, her eyes awake before the rest of her body. "You're awake?" she whispered. "Yes," he replied, rubbing his wrists, still sore from the ropes the day before. Tiva pulled out a small strip of dried meat from her pouch and offered it to him. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. He accepted it with a quiet nod, trying not to eat it too fast. His stomach ached from hunger, a sharp reminder of how long it had been since his last real meal. Tiva ate her share in silence, taking smaller bites. Trace noticed the way she rationed it, like someone who had done this many times before. He chewed slowly, too, matching her pace, not wanting to take more than his share. "The camp will wake soon," Tiva said. "We leave before that." Trace understood the urgency. Staying near the renegades was tempting fate. Either they'd grab him again, or question him as if they hadn't already traded him off like worn-out goods. He also knew Tiva needed to vanish just as quickly. She'd already broken ties with her people. She didn't belong to that camp either. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Somewhere no one will look for me," she answered plainly. It wasn't a clear answer, but it was an honest one. Trace stood, stretching until the stiffness in his back gave way. He peeked through the shelter's entrance. Out there, between the trees, the camp was beginning to stir. Distant voices echoed, then another joined in. Metal clanged against metal. Horses huffed in the dust. The sounds of a new day rising. Tiva noticed it too. "We have to go now," she said. "If they see you with me, there'll be questions." Trace adjusted his coat, ignoring the pain pulsing through his ribs. "I can walk," he said. She looked him over, gauging his condition. He stood tall despite the bruises. His movements were careful but steady. He wasn't swaying. Tiva gave a single nod. As they stepped out of the shelter, the cold air hit them immediately. She wrapped herself in her deerskin cloak. Trace noticed the way her body trembled. It wasn't fear. It was exhaustion and cold. Trace Morvan moved a few steps ahead to make sure the trail was clear. They followed a narrow path between the trees. Tiva Mooneye walked behind him, light and silent. Her steps were careful, like stepping on air. With a small twig, she swept away the footprints they left behind, erasing any sign of their passage. But in Trace's mind, images from the night before kept returning. The way she had stood in front of the renegades. The way she had handed over everything she had without hesitation. He still didn't fully understand her reasons, but he'd decided not to ask. Not yet. Being alive was reason enough, for now. After climbing a low ridge, the sounds of the camp faded behind them. Tiva slowed, her breath coming harder. Trace caught sight again of the bruise on her arm, the one she kept forcing herself to ignore. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" he asked. She walked a few more steps before replying. "Nothing out of the ordinary," she said without looking at him. It wasn't defiance, it was truth. Pain, for her, had become routine. Trace stayed quiet. He listened to the change in her breathing, felt the weight she carried, even though she never spoke of it. After another half-mile, they reached a clearing with short grass and scattered stones. Tiva stopped, tuning her ears. Her eyes scanned the sky, the ridge behind, the brush off to the left. "We're safe here, for now," she said. She dropped down onto a rock and stretched her fingers, easing the stiffness in her hands. Trace sat across from her. "Tell me about the men chasing you," he said, calm and without pressure. Tiva hesitated. She didn't like revisiting that. Her voice dropped lower. "They blamed me for a raid. I wasn't there, but they said a woman had to pay." Trace had seen that kind of thing before in the towns along the border. Leaders covering their own mistakes by choosing someone weaker as the scapegoat. He didn't need the whole story. He saw it written in the way she held herself. "And they're not going to stop looking for you?" he asked. Tiva shook her head. "They need someone to blame. They picked me." Trace exhaled slowly, holding back his reaction. It wasn't surprise he felt. It was quiet anger. He knew all too well what it meant to be thrown away. He'd been used, betrayed. And in Tiva's eyes, he recognized that same kind of weariness. "We'll stay ahead of them," he said steadily. Tiva looked at him for the first time since they met. There was a visible shift in her gaze. Not hope exactly, but the beginning of something different. The feeling of not being alone in the decisions anymore. She stood. "We keep walking until the sun's high. Then we'll look for water." "You lead," Trace replied. They kept moving. The land sloped down into a stretch of scattered brush. Trace stayed close. He watched the surroundings, looking for signs of riders, tracks, trouble. Tiva set a pace she could maintain. It wasn't fast, but it was steady. They didn't waste breath on words that weren't needed. Their silence wasn't cold. It was a silent pact. Both of them tired. Both hunted. Both needing each other just to reach the next hour. When they reached the dry creek bed ahead, Tiva stopped abruptly. She crouched down and touched the dirt with her fingertips. She lifted a faint mark, a curved indentation, a fresh horseshoe. Her breath caught. "Someone passed through here today," she whispered. Trace knelt beside her, reading the ground. "A rider. Wasn't moving fast?" Tiva nodded. It matched what she'd seen. "Could be a tracker," she said. "Could be a stranger," he replied. Both options were bad. Tiva straightened slowly, tightening the strap on her pouch. She looked at Trace, watching how he handled uncertainty. Calm. Alert. Ready to move without panic. "You walk with me," she said softly. "I'm here," he answered. It was the first moment that felt like a real agreement. Not just two people running, but two souls choosing to move forward. Together. They stepped into the dry riverbed. Their shadows stretched across the pale earth. Two hunted figures walking with quiet caution, starting a journey neither had planned. But both now understood, belonged to them both. The sun climbed higher as they followed the narrow streambed west. The ground was littered with loose stones that shifted under their boots, forcing them to walk lightly. Tiva Munai led the way. Her eyes scanned every bush, every dip in the land, every small detail. Trace Morvan watched her in silence, noticing how her shoulders tensed slightly when she sensed something was off. He stayed a few steps behind, giving her space, but close enough to act if danger showed up. By mid-morning, the heat had begun to settle into the valley. Sweat trickled down Trace's neck, and the pain in his ribs worsened with every breath. He didn't say a word. Complaining had never helped, and he wasn't about to slow Tiva down for it. She didn't show pain as she walked either, but he could tell her body was running on empty. Her pace was steady, her breath even, but her steps grew heavier, and she blinked more often. They reached a cluster of large rocks where the shade cut across the riverbed. Tiva stopped and dropped down onto a flat stone. Her knees shook as they bent. Trace sat beside her without needing to be asked. "We rest here a while," she murmured. He nodded, resting his elbows on his knees, letting the tension ease from his back. He ran a thumb over the scab on his jaw, feeling the tightness of the skin. And in his head, the same quiet questions circled. How much farther did they need to go? Was that rider tracking them? And how much longer would his ribs hold out? Tiva took a deep breath and opened her small cloth pouch. Inside were just a few scraps of dried meat. She tore one in half and handed him the bigger piece. Trace hesitated. "You need it," he said. "You're hurt," she replied, firm but worn. "You need strength." He didn't argue further. He took the portion and chewed it slowly. It was tough meat, but enough to give him back a little steadiness. Tiva ate her share with the same silent determination as always. She swallowed hard and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Tracks. From Ryder, not far," she said quietly. "You think he's looking for you?" Trace asked. Maybe someone else. But I don't trust it." Trace watched her face as she spoke. Her jaw clenched, her brow barely furrowed. It wasn't loud fear. It was the quiet kind, the kind only known by those who faced danger up close more than once. That kind of fear. He understood well. It reminded him of those endless nights driving cattle when danger was near, but hadn't shown itself yet. "You've been running a long time," he said. Tiva didn't deny it. "Since the raid," she answered. "They needed someone to punish. My name was the easiest." "Why you?" Trace asked. There was no pressure in his voice, only a need to understand. "I once spoke out against them," she said. "They didn't forget." Trace nodded slowly. He'd seen the same thing happen among ranchers, bosses punishing the one who dared to speak up. He felt a knot form in his chest, a mix of empathy and quiet anger. A rage not aimed at her, but at a world that keeps pushing people like her to the edge. Tiva lifted her head, alert to a sound only she seemed to hear. After a few seconds, she gave a soft shake of her head. "Just wind," she murmured to herself, and to him. Trace stood up, stretching his back. "We'll need to move soon." Tiva rose with effort. Her legs trembled at first. She paused a moment until she could hold herself steady. Trace took hold of her elbow without thinking. She didn't pull away. She let him help her balance before standing on her own. They kept moving westward until the riverbed narrowed between two sloping ridges. The ground turned softer, and faint tracks began to show in the fine dust. Tiva Mooneye crouched, running her fingers gently over the marks. Trace Morvan leaned beside her. "A rider," she confirmed. "Alone and slow," he added. "He's not tracking hard." Tiva studied the tracks in silence, her gaze long and steady. "He turned here," she said, pointing to a curve where the hoofprints veered north. "Then we go south." Trace nodded. He followed her as they skirted the riverbed, which opened into a dry prairie. Tall grasses brushed against their legs as they crossed to the far side. Tiva stopped again, scanning the sky and the ridge behind them. "We'll find water soon," she said. Her voice was tight. "I know a place from years ago." Trace saw her body tense more than usual. She was nearing her limit. Without a word, he adjusted his pace to match hers. They kept walking another mile until the ground turned rocky and dipped into a shallow hollow. Below, a thin stream of water ran between the stones. Tiva let out a breath, like she'd been holding it for hours. She crouched down and splashed water onto her face, rubbing her eyes with both hands. Trace knelt beside her, cupped his hands, and drank until the burn in his throat eased. Tiva brushed her hair away from her neck and dipped the back of it into the stream. The water slid down her shoulders, washing away layers of dust. Trace stayed close, watching the surroundings while she rested. Several minutes passed before Tiva finally sat on a flat rock. Trace joined her. "Looks like you haven't slept more than an hour," he said. "You don't sleep well when you're being hunted," she replied. He studied her face. "Last night, I heard you wake up 3 times. Tiva didn't look at him, but gave a small nod. "I thought the ones from the camp might come." "They won't now," Trace said. "Not this far out." She exhaled slowly, like she wanted to believe him. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, listening to the water murmuring over the stones. Trace broke the stillness. "Yesterday you said I don't look at you like the others. What did you mean?" Tiva hesitated. She frowned slightly, choosing her words carefully. "Most men look at a woman and only think about what they want. You look and think about what's happening around you. You see the danger, not me." Trace let the words sink in. "I'm used to trouble, and to being looked at for the wrong reasons," she added. Trace held her gaze. "I won't be one of them." Tiva didn't look away right away. She stared at him for a long moment before lowering her eyes. Her shoulders loosened, just a little. When she stood, she braced herself against a rock for balance. "We'll move on soon," she said, "but rest a little longer first." Trace nodded. He stayed seated, watching the trail they'd come from, while Tiva closed her eyes for a few minutes. She didn't sleep, but the stillness gave her back a bit of strength. That moment, quiet, exhausted, contained, held more trust than any words they'd shared. There was no need to say it. They weren't moving just out of necessity anymore, but by choice. The afternoon cooled as they left the hollow, following an animal path that cut through low brush. The ground began to rise, leading them toward a band of pine trees where the air turned sharper and the light dimmed beneath the branches. Tiva walked more slowly now, not because she'd lost strength, but because she was managing what little she had left. Trace noticed every small change. The pause before each step, the hand that occasionally pressed against her ribs, the slight tremble in her fingers. He stayed close enough to catch her if she stumbled, but far enough not to crowd her. She didn't ask for help, and he didn't force it on her. Trace Morvan had learned long ago that some people didn't stay upright by muscle, but by pride they couldn't afford to lose. At the edge of the woods, Tiva Mooneye stopped and placed a hand against a tree trunk. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, steadying her breath. Trace stepped up quietly. "You need a break," he said. "We can't stop for long," she replied, forcing her lungs to settle. "Someone might still be nearby." Trace scanned the trees. The forest was still. No hoofbeats, no voices, no snapping branches. Only the wind threading through the pine needles. 5 minutes won't kill us," he said calmly. Tiva hesitated, then nodded. She let herself drop to the base of the tree. Her legs gave slightly before she caught herself. Trace crouched nearby, resting his hands on his thighs, keeping watch on the path behind them. "Your bruises are worse today," he said. She pulled her arm in toward her chest. They'll fade. Not if you keep pushing without rest. Tiva opened her eyes and looked at him closely, trying to read whether he was scolding her or simply stating a fact. There was no judgment in his face, only concern. And that surprised her more than she wanted to admit. After a shared silence, she spoke. You're hurt too. My ribs will heal, Trace said. So will mine. He almost smiled at the stubborn way she said it. But the situation wasn't one for joking. Instead, he reached inside his coat and pulled out a small piece of cloth he'd torn from the inner lining. He wet it with a few drops of water and held it out. Cool the skin, he said. Tiva took the cloth without looking at him directly. She rolled up her sleeve and pressed the damp fabric to her arm. The cold made her flinch slightly, but the relief came quick. She lowered her head, thankful for that small break from the pain. You were a rancher once, she said quietly. He hadn't expected that question in that moment, but he answered. Years ago. Why'd you leave? Trace shifted slightly. His jaw tensed. That memory wasn't something he often shared, with anyone. But something in the way she asked, soft, careful, without pressure, pulled out a small truth. Men I trusted turned on me, he said. I didn't want to stay in a place that wasn't safe anymore. Tiva took in his words slowly. Then, you understand? She said. Trace looked at her. Understand what? She lowered the cloth. Running from the ones who were supposed to protect you. Her voice didn't shake, but there was something in the tone that showed how deep that wound went. Trace nodded. No questions, no digging, just understanding. Tiva stood, testing her balance. We go now. The forest is good for hiding. Trace rose with her. You lead. They entered the forest, where the light faded instantly. A carpet of pine needles softened every step. Tiva moved ahead, slower now, but with steady direction. She pointed to a narrow gap, almost invisible, between the trunks of the pines. Deer trail, she whispered. Hard to track. Trace followed, pushing low branches aside with his hand. The woods closed around them, everything turning to layered greens and browns. Tiva slowed as the trail opened into a small clearing. She scanned every corner, sky, ground, shadows. Only then did she move forward. This place is good, she said. We'll stay here tonight. Trace agreed. The clearing offered natural cover, fallen logs, thick brush, and a slight rise that worked as a lookout. He dropped his bag to the ground and crouched to gather dry branches. Tiva made a motion to help, but her hand trembled. Trace placed a gentle hand on her wrist. Sit down. I've got it. She tensed, ready to argue, but she stopped when she saw his face. Trace Morvan wasn't trying to take control. He was simply giving her space to rest. Tiva Mooneye sat near the center of the clearing and watched him work. His movements were steady and deliberate. He built the fire pit by clearing a round patch of dirt, circling it with stones, and layering kindling in neat rows. She noticed how he carried out every step, without rush, without carelessness. You know a lot, she said quietly. He shrugged. I learned long ago to rely on no one but myself. She understood that far too well. When the fire finally caught, Tiva leaned toward the warmth. Her shoulders lowered. The tightness around her eyes eased. Trace sat across from her, stretching out his legs. They ate the last of the dried meat in silence. Tiva's portion was small, but she made herself eat it slowly. She looked at him once. You still haven't asked me where we're going. Why? Trace rested his forearms on his knees. Because running alone kills you. Running with someone gives you a chance. Ors maino. And you trust me? She asked. He waited a moment before answering. Enough to be here. Tiva's eyes softened at his words. Trust was rare for both of them. To hear it spoken plainly like that hit deeper than she expected. Night crept in slow. The air turned colder. Tiva wrapped her arms around herself to keep in the warmth. Trace noticed and moved closer, stopping just short of touching her. You can sleep now, he said. I'll keep watch. You sleep first, she insisted. You need it more. He shook his head. If something comes close, I'll hear it first. I know the sounds of this land. He considered her words. She was right. Her ears caught danger before his ever did. Her instinct had kept them one step ahead since the moment they fled the camp. It's fine, he said at last. Wake me when you get tired. Tiva gave a single nod. She remained upright, listening to the forest. Trace leaned back against a fallen log, keeping one eye half open, watching her. Her silhouette, outlined by the firelight, looked worn out, but steady. She rubbed the damp cloth over her bruised arm, easing the ache. Trace felt something new and unfamiliar stirring inside him. It wasn't a burden. It wasn't obligation. It felt natural. She had bought his freedom. Yes. But she had also taken a risk that could have easily cost her life. Staying close felt like the right thing to do. As night deepened, Tiva stayed alert to the sounds of the forest. The wind, the insects, the snap of twigs. Trace let his eyelids close. He knew that if anything changed, she would wake him. They weren't just running from danger anymore. They had begun to look out for each other. By dawn, the fire had died down to faint, red embers. Trace woke to the soft sound of Tiva's footsteps. She stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the woods with the stillness of someone who noticed every small shift in the land. Her back rose and fell with steady breaths. Her loose hair caught the pale light of morning across her shoulders. She hadn't slept more than an hour. Trace sat up slowly, his ribs aching from sleeping on uneven ground. Tiva turned slightly at the sound of movement. Her expression was guarded. You should sleep a little longer, he said. Too much noise in my head. Hard to shut it off, she replied. Trace understood. He'd spent years sleeping light, expecting trouble with every sound. He stood slowly and stepped up beside her. The cold air bit at the skin on his face. What do you hear? He asked. Tiva pointed towards the distant ridge. Birds are quiet. Silence where they should be singing. Trace strained to listen. She was right. The forest was strangely still for that hour. Fewer songs, less movement. You think it's a rider? He asked. Tiva hesitated. Could be. Could be an animal. But it's early for this kind of silence. Trace Morvan looked toward the ridge. Nothing moved, but his stomach clenched with that sharp instinct of being watched. He took a deep breath and kept his voice steady. We eat, then we move. Tiva Mooneye nodded. She knelt by her bag and pulled out the little food they had left. A handful of dried berries, a thin strip of meat, and crumbs from something she'd kept longer than she should have. She divided it evenly, without hesitation. Trace frowned. You need more than that. We share it even, she said, placing half in his hand. If you fall, I fall too. He didn't argue further. He ate slowly, watching her stretch each bite. Her cheeks were slightly hollow from hunger, and her eyes carried the weight of someone who never let their guard down. After the meal, Tiva rinsed her hands with water from the nearby stream. Trace helped her break down the fire pit, covering the ashes so no smoke would betray them. Before they left, Tiva crouched and pressed her palm to the ground, feeling the earth, searching for vibrations or signs of movement. It was a habit that came naturally to her. "Nothing fresh around here," she murmured. "We head toward the rocks, to the west." Trace nodded. "You lead. I'll watch our back." They moved deeper into the forest, weaving between tall pines. The ground felt damp under their boots, and the air carried that cold edge that warned of rain on the horizon. Tiva walked with confidence, despite her exhaustion. She chose paths that left no trace. Trace stayed close, glancing behind now and then, knowing how exposed they'd be if anyone was trailing them. After an hour of walking, they reached a gentle slope where the forest opened onto a small plateau scattered with rocks. Along one edge, the wind had shaped a kind of natural shelter. Tiva stopped beside a large stone, placing her hand on its surface. "I hid here once, when I was a girl," she said. "Good spot to watch from." Trace climbed the rise beside her. From above, the valley unfolded in long folds. Brush, grass, scattered trees, and a dry stream bed cutting across the land. He scanned for movement, tracks, smoke. Nothing obvious. "You think someone's nearby?" he asked as they stepped back down. Tiva didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved over the distant shapes. "I think danger moves faster than we do," she said finally. Trace lowered his voice. "Then we stay ahead of it." She nodded, but didn't move. She stayed very still, as if deciding whether to share something she'd held back for a long time. "When they blamed me," she began, voice quieter now, "I thought they'd come for me that same night. I waited with a knife in hand. But no one came. The next morning they said I had to pay for the men killed in the raid. I wasn't even there." Trace's jaw tightened. They needed someone easy to blame. Tiva looked down, fingers clenched against her side. "They wanted silence. I'd spoken out against the leader, weeks before." Trace wasn't surprised. He'd seen what they did to those who stood up for the right reasons. He didn't try to console her with hollow words. He just let her speak, for as long as she needed. "I ran in the dark, with my mother's things. I lost one, only carried what I could hold." She swallowed. "I thought someone would follow me right away, but they waited until sunrise. They hunted me after, and then another group saw me and thought I was part of the trouble." Trace let out a slow breath. "You've been on your own since then." Tiva nodded. "Until yesterday." He looked at her more closely. Her face showed fatigue, but also a grit that kept pushing through every blow, every fall. "You're not alone anymore," Trace said. Tiva lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes directly. There was no sudden shift, no dramatic emotion, but something subtle changed in her posture. Her shoulders eased, her breathing leveled. "Then we walk together," she said softly. "Yes," Trace replied. "Together." They continued west, weaving between the large rocks until they reached a narrow opening that led into a deeper part of the forest. Trace noticed Tiva slowing again. He stepped ahead and pushed aside a low branch so she wouldn't have to struggle with it. Tiva paused behind him. "Why do you help me so much?" she asked gently. Trace looked back over his shoulder. "Because you helped me first. That was out of respect. I chose to do it." Cole didn't respond right away. He chose his words carefully. "It's been a long time since I trusted anyone. I figured it didn't matter anymore. But you didn't trade me to gain anything. You gave up everything you had just to escape. I owe you a lot, and I respect what it cost you." Tiva blinked, as if every word landed with an unfamiliar weight. She stepped a little closer. "You're staying because you want to?" "Yes," he said simply. That answer seemed to settle something inside her, something she'd buried ever since the accusations first fell on her shoulders. They started walking again, this time shoulder to shoulder, no longer one ahead of the other. The small gaps between them closed on their own. There was no forced closeness, just the awareness of two people moving in the same rhythm. Toward the end of the afternoon, they found a natural rock formation, shaped by years of wind and rain. It offered shelter from the wind and a clear view of the trail behind. Tiva touched the ground, sweeping leaves aside with her hand. "This place'll do for the night," she decided. Cole nodded. "We'll make it work here." They started gathering wood and setting up the small camp. Tiva's hands moved slower now. Every motion cost her more. Cole noticed the tremble returning to her shoulders and gently took the bundle of wood from her. "Let me," he said. "Sit. Rest." This time Tiva didn't argue. She dropped down onto a flat stone, leaning forward to ease the tension in her back. She watched him work, her gaze steady but tired. When the fire finally caught, she let out a sigh she'd been holding all day. The light warmed her face, and Cole sat beside her, not so close as to push her, but close enough to be present. For the first time since fleeing the camp, the silence between them didn't feel heavy with fear or uncertainty. It felt like part of something taking shape, something forming slowly in the quiet, something solid neither of them had expected when the day began. Night came early under the rock shelf. The fire burned low but steady, casting a soft glow against the rough walls. Tiva sat close to the flame, rubbing her hands to bring warmth back into her fingers. Cole, just a few feet away, was sharpening a small blade he'd found in her bag. The scrape of metal on stone was the only sound for long minutes. Tiva watched the motion of the blade between his fingers. Her eyelids were heavy with exhaustion, but she didn't lower her guard. She'd spent too many nights waiting for danger to fall out of the silence. Cole noticed. "You should sleep now," he said. "I will soon," she replied. And soon meant not yet. He didn't push. A cold gust slipped in under the rock ledge. Tiva hugged herself tighter. Cole saw it. Without a word, he picked up his jacket from the ground and held it out to her. Tiva looked at it for a second, as if weighing whether to accept something clearly important to him. "Use it," Cole said. "I don't need it as much as you do." She hesitated a beat longer, then took it gently. The fabric was rough, but warm. She pulled it around her shoulders and fastened it high at the collar. Cole watched her settle into it. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than before. Cole nodded. The fire crackled gently, and Tiva leaned toward it, letting the heat brush her face. After another stretch of silence, she spoke. "You trust me enough to sleep near me? That surprises me." Cole didn't look up from the blade. "If I didn't trust you, I'd be sitting with my back to the rock, and a weapon in my hand." Tiva thought about that. "You're not afraid I'll hurt you?" "No," he said simply. She lowered her gaze. "Yesterday, I was afraid of you." Cole finally looked up. "And now?" She shook her head. "Not anymore." Something shifted inside Cole's chest, a quiet tension he'd been holding ever since she bought his freedom. It wasn't attachment. Not yet. It was recognition. Two people deciding, without saying it, that they didn't want the other to disappear. Tiva stretched her legs and winced as the muscle in her thigh seized suddenly. Trace noticed it instantly, You need to rest that leg, he said. I can walk, she replied. I know, he said back. But you're hurt. Tiva frowned, not from pain, but from being seen. She wasn't used to someone noticing the small signs. You watch everything, she whispered. Old habit, said Trace, and you watch me more than you admit. Trace's jaw tightened. It wasn't discomfort. It was the truth being named out loud. I'm trying to keep us alive, he said. She looked him straight in the eyes. You care, she said slowly, like someone unraveling a certainty. Trace didn't answer right away. He didn't know how much he wanted to admit. But after a few seconds, he exhaled. Yes, he said quietly. I care. Tiva held that truth between them, letting it settle in the air. A gust of cold slipped into the shelter. Trace added another branch to the fire. The warmth filled the small space again. Tiva wrapped herself tighter in the jacket. You should sleep first, she said. I'll keep watch. You kept watch last night, Trace replied. She shook her head. I hear danger first. Trace looked at her closely. She was telling the truth. Her senses were sharp. Her instinct was tied to the earth. He forced his shoulders to relax. Wake me if anything shifts. Tiva nodded. Trace lay back on the blanket they had spread earlier. He faced the fire, one hand resting near the knife hidden in his boot, though he didn't grip it. Tiva stayed seated a few steps away, listening to the wind moving through the branches. As Trace's breathing began to slow, she focused all her attention on the woods. Every sound mattered. The dry crack of a branch, the brushing of leaves, even the way the firelight shifted. She had lived too long with fear not to know when danger was drawing near. That night felt tense, but not immediate. Trace slept lightly, the way men sleep when they don't fully trust the dark. Tiva glanced at him now and then, her expression softer. She didn't entirely understand why he stayed with her, but she knew what it felt like to be left behind. And he hadn't left. After an hour, she reached over and gently touched his shoulder. Your turn, she whispered. He woke instantly, eyes sharp, then relaxed when he recognized her. Anything? Nothing nearby, she said. But the animals are quiet. Better to stay alert. Trace sat up, stretching his back. Now you rest. Tiva curled up in the spot he had left, still wrapped in his jacket, using her small pouch as a pillow. Her breathing steadied quickly, the kind of sleep only exhaustion could bring. Trace looked at her for a moment. He noticed how small she looked beneath the jacket, how tightly she clung to herself. Even in sleep, Trace Morvan felt a constant sense of duty. It wasn't forced or burdensome, just that inner clarity that someone had to stay awake, had to watch, had to protect her. He stayed up long after Tiva Moonai's breathing had settled into rhythm, eyes on the forest, scanning the shadows, his hand steady on the hilt of his knife each time the wind carried an unfamiliar sound. Nothing came close, but the tension didn't leave. And as the night deepened, one clear thought settled in Trace's mind. They weren't moving together out of desperation anymore. They were starting to rely on each other. It wasn't something they'd planned, but it was something they were beginning to choose. Morning arrived in silence. A silence that didn't yet feel safe, but no longer felt dangerous either. A thin line of gray light slipped through the rock's opening as Trace finished the last hour of watch. Tiva was still asleep, curled beneath his jacket, breathing with a peace she hadn't shown since they'd left the border camp. He didn't wake her right away. She needed that rest more than she would ever admit. When she finally stirred, she rubbed her eyes slowly and sat up with a faint groan of stiffness. Trace watched her rise, her hair falling over her face until she pushed it back with her fingers. "You didn't sleep enough," he said, noting the shadows under her eyes. "I slept what I needed," she replied. It was a quiet night. Tiva glanced toward the tree line, alert. "The forest feels different today. Not as heavy as yesterday." "Safer?" Trace asked. "Maybe. But we should still keep moving." They packed up the little they had. Trace folded his jacket and offered it to her. Tiva hesitated just a second before handing it back. "You'll need it more today," she said. "The cold grips the ribs." He didn't argue. He slipped it on carefully, the fabric pressing softly against his sore side. They left the shelter and walked along a narrow ridge that overlooked a long valley. The terrain was uneven, sloping downward, forcing them to move slowly. Tiva pointed to a barely visible trail, marked by deer. "This path hides our tracks," she said. Trace followed her through the brush. He noticed how she tested each patch of ground before stepping forward, checking for loose soil, listening for branches that might snap. She moved like someone who'd lived too long expecting to be hunted. After an hour, they reached a small clearing where the grass rose to their waists. Tiva crouched down and motioned for Trace to do the same. "Why are we slowing down?" he whispered. "Someone came through here," she said. "Look at the grass." Trace studied the ground. Several stalks were bent in the same direction, not by wind, but by weight. A single path crossed the field, narrow but recent. "A traveler," Tiva murmured. "Light step. Maybe a scout." Trace's jaw tightened. "Are we being followed?" Tiva shook her head. "Too soon to tell. Could be a hunter, or someone run out from another camp." Trace scanned the clearing. In the distance, a cluster of birds suddenly burst from the trees, scattering fast. He didn't like that sign. "We stay low," he said. They crossed the clearing in a crouch, moving slowly until they reached the far side, where brush grew thick beside a rocky bed of dry creek. Tiva stepped carefully between the stones and sat on a rock to rest her knees. Trace sat down beside her, breathing deeper than usual. He hadn't said anything about his ribs, but the downhill stretch had pulled hard on the injured muscle. "You're worse today," Tiva said. He didn't deny it. "I'm still moving." "You don't have to hide the pain from me," she said. "I'm not hiding it," he replied. "I just know stopping makes us vulnerable." Tiva looked at him closely, studying him with seriousness. "I'm not going to leave you behind," she said. Trace stopped. Her voice was firm, without drama. She wasn't trying to comfort him. She was stating a fact. "Good to know," he answered quietly. Tiva leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees. Her hand brushed the necklace she wore around her neck, a small strand of beads that had survived the raid. She almost never touched it, but when she did, Trace knew she was thinking of something from before the running started. "What happens if they catch you?" he asked. Tiva didn't hesitate a second. "They take me back. They judge me in front of everyone." The punishment would be quick and harsh. Trace felt his stomach tighten. Anger started to rise in him. She wasn't saying it with fear or exaggeration. She spoke with the calm of someone who had already accepted what could come. "They won't catch you," he said firmly. Tiva looked at him, searching his face to see if he believed what he'd just said. After a few seconds, she gave a single nod. "We keep heading west," she said. They followed the dry creek for another kilometer, until the trees closed in again, and the light filtered through in broken shafts. Tiva stopped abruptly. She raised her hand slightly, like she felt something before she saw it. Trace froze beside her. "What is it?" he whispered. Tiva narrowed her eyes. "Smoke. Small fire." Trace inhaled carefully. He caught it too. A faint scent carried by the breeze. Not strong, but close enough to matter. "Someone camping?" he asked. "We wait," she said. Trace scanned the area, memorizing possible escape routes. "We can't walk toward that." "No," Tiva confirmed. "But we can look." She motioned for him to follow her up a side trail that curved uphill. They moved slowly, placing each foot with precision, avoiding dry branches and loose stones. The slope leveled out at a high point, overlooking a small pocket of trees below. Through the branches, a thin line of smoke rose from a hidden campfire. No voices, no visible movement. Tiva crouched lower. "This doesn't feel right." Trace studied it carefully. "Why?" "The fire looks controlled. Concealed. Someone who doesn't want to be seen." He didn't like that. "Could just be a hunter," he suggested. Tiva shook her head. "Hunters don't hide fire like that in open land. This is a waiting fire. Someone is waiting." A weight settled in Trace's chest. "Then we don't go any closer." "No," she said. "We leave the forest. Find different ground." They backed away carefully, breaking no branches, leaving no trace. When they were finally at a safe distance, Tiva exhaled more freely. "Someone's following the trail," she said. Trace didn't argue it. The signs were already too clear, but instead of fear, Tiva's face hardened with resolve. "We leave this zone," she said. "Cross through the rocks, west. Harder to track us there." Trace nodded. "You lead. I'll cover the rear." They moved fast, knowing the distance between them and whoever was behind that fire was shrinking. The tension didn't drive them apart. It drew them closer. That instinct to protect sharpened with every step. As they climbed toward a rocky ridge, Tiva paused a moment and looked back at him. "You could have left already," she murmured. "And you didn't." Trace held her gaze without turning away. "I'm not leaving." Tiva held his eyes a second longer. Her throat tightened with a gratitude she didn't speak aloud. They reached the top of the ridge, both breathing hard, eyes scanning the shadows behind them. The danger was real now, closer than either wanted to admit. But they faced it together. They were no longer two strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were two people making choices for each other. Ahead, the ridge stretched in long, uneven layers of rock. Every step demanded more balance than strength. Trace Morvan stayed half a step behind Tiva Mooneye, watching how her boots searched for hold between the stones. The air thinned at that height, carrying a faint smell of dry dust and old pine. Behind them, the forest already seemed far away, swallowed by the shadows. Neither of them spoke for nearly half an hour, both too focused on putting distance between themselves and the hidden fire. By midday, the heat bounced off the rocks, making it harder to breathe. Tiva stopped on a narrow ledge and leaned her back against the wall, one hand on her chest, trying to steady her breath. Trace moved in closer. "Just out of air, a little," she said. Her voice was tight. The strain marked her tone. "You didn't sleep enough," he replied. "Neither did you." He didn't argue, but he watched her closely. Her lips were dry, and the effort had deepened the bruise on her arm. Trace reached into the shared bag and pulled out the canteen. Tiva took it, drinking small, measured sips. She didn't hand it back right away. Instead, she looked downhill, eyes narrowed. "No one's on us yet," she said. But someone's tracking. I can feel it. Trace believed her. Her instinct had already saved them more than once. We'll keep moving, he said. But at your pace this time. Tiva gave a slight nod. It wasn't approval. It was acceptance. They kept along the ridge until the terrain eased into a series of wide, flat stone platforms. Tiva led him to a flat outcrop with a natural dip in the center. It was low enough to hide their silhouettes, but open enough to see if anyone approached. This place works for rest, she said. Trace nodded. They sat on opposite sides of the dip, facing each other. Tiva leaned back on her hands, stretching out her legs. Trace noticed how hard she fought to keep her back straight. The exhaustion clung to her like a shadow, even if she tried to hide it. You're still pushing yourself too hard, he said. If I stop, danger catches up to us. It won't catch us today. She turned her gaze toward him, searching his face for doubt. She found none, and her shoulders eased, just a little. Trace picked up the canteen again and dampened a strip of cloth. He sat down beside her and raised his hand. Your arm's worse, he said. Let me clean it. Tiva tensed, caught between instinct and trust. After a few seconds, she extended her arm. The skin was swollen and discolored. The cut, deeper now, surrounded by the bruise. Trace cleaned it carefully. Tiva kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. She tried not to react as the cool cloth passed over the tender skin. When he pressed just a bit too much, her breath hitched. Sorry, he murmured. It's fine, she replied, though her jaw clenched. You should have told me it hurt that much. I thought it would pass, she said honestly. It hurts more today. Yeah. Trace wrapped the arm with a strip torn from the lining of his own shirt. It wasn't clean, but it was all they had left. Tiva watched his hands with quiet focus, the deliberate movement, how he worked to avoid hurting her more than necessary. When he finished, she looked at the bandage, touched it gently, then turned her eyes to him. You're helping me again, she said. You'd do the same, Trace replied. Tiva didn't answer right away. She hugged her legs, head down. I didn't think anyone would stay with me, she whispered. Why not? Because danger follows me. Most people avoid that. Trace took a deep breath, voice steady. I've been alone a long time. I didn't think I'd end up staying with someone again, Tiva whispered. But here I am. Trace held her gaze. There wasn't a big gesture, no swelling of emotion. But something shifted. Her hardened expression softened. Her shoulders lowered, and the tension around her eyes warmed. They rested there until the light began to change, softening with the coming afternoon. Tiva stood slowly, testing her arm. The pain was still there, but it was manageable now. We go down to the valley before it gets dark, she said. You lead, Trace replied. I'll cover the rear. They descended the other side of the ridge, through a steep gap between the rocks. On the far side, the land opened into a wide valley with tall grass and scattered trees. The wind carried the scent of water. Tiva pointed ahead. A stream. Good place to fill water. As they neared it, Trace suddenly stopped and raised his hand in warning. Tiva froze instantly. What is it? She whispered. Trace crouched, pointing toward some rocks ahead. Between them, faint tracks marked the dust. Fresh. No more than 2 or 3 hours old. Tiva's chest tightened. One man? Trace asked, studying the pattern. Or two, walking slow to find us? He scanned the surroundings again. Might be, might not, he said. But they're close. Tiva looked toward the stream, then at the long valley ahead. If we turn back, we get cornered. If we move forward, we risk running into them. Trace nodded slowly. We move forward, but slow, and leave no trace. Tiva's breathing deepened. The tension was rising, but she didn't panic. She stepped closer to him and lowered her voice even more. "If something happens," she said, "you run. I'll stop them." Trace turned sharply. "No." Her eyes widened slightly at the firmness in his voice. "We stay together," he said. "No more running alone." Tiva watched him closely. His calm, his certainty, and the fear in her face shifted. It didn't disappear, but it mixed with something stronger. "I trust you," she said softly. Trace held her gaze. "Good, because I'm not letting you face anything alone." They crossed the valley in silence, following the stream's course through the tall grass. Every sound mattered now. The creak of the wind, the movement of stones beneath their boots, the faint snap of a branch in the distance. The danger was close. Closer than ever. But they didn't separate. They walked side by side, their steps in rhythm without even trying. For the first time since it all began, Tiva felt the weight of fear begin to ease. Not because the threat had passed, but because she wasn't carrying it alone anymore. The valley narrowed as they followed the stream. The grass grew taller, brushing their legs and muffling their steps. Trace constantly scanned the edges of the water, searching for movement among reeds or shadows between rocks. Tiva stayed close, her arm bandaged by him, her breathing steady, though uneven with fatigue and concern. They didn't speak. Every sound around them carried weight, a faint crunch, a broken branch, from behind. Trace stopped instantly. Tiva froze beside him. Both listened without moving. The stream made small, hollow sounds as it nudged pebbles in its path. But over that murmur came something else. Footsteps. Slow ones. Trace signaled to Tiva with 2 fingers, pointing to a cluster of large rocks on the right. She nodded and crouched, slipping behind a fallen tree. Trace followed her, close enough to react if anything suddenly appeared. The footsteps were coming closer. Trace placed his hand lightly on the handle of his knife. Tiva held her breath, her eyes wide but steady. A shadow moved through the tall grass. Then another. "There's no rope, no camp, no danger tying you to me," whispered Tiva Mooneye, barely audible. Trace Morvan edged a little closer, his voice low but firm. "I'm not leaving." Tiva swallowed, and her eyes shimmered in a way she couldn't hide. "Not even if danger returns?" "No," he replied. "I'm here because I choose to be." She breathed slowly, deeply, as if those words had released something she'd kept bound for far too long. She reached her hand toward his, not with urgency or certainty, but with a deliberate, measured slowness. Trace didn't pull away. He let her fingers rest on his, and wrapped his around hers gently. The warmth passed between them. It wasn't intense, nor rushed. It was real, steady, an anchor. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, stretching shadows across the hidden hollow, they stayed sitting by the pond in silence. There was no longer fear nipping at their heels. The danger had lost their trail, and the land ahead was theirs to choose. For the first time, moving forward didn't feel like running. It felt like the beginning of a place where they both might stay. The night brought calm to the shelter. No distant footsteps, no snapping branches, no signs of pursuit. Trace slept light, but without fear, waking now and then to scan the edges before settling again beside Tiva. She slept deeper than she had in days. When dawn touched the tops of the rocks, Tiva woke slowly, blinking at the soft light filtering through the brush. Trace was by the pond, rinsing his hands. He looked up when he heard her stir. Morning. Tiva sat up slowly, wrapping herself in the blanket. Today feels different, she said. Trace nodded. Safer. She studied him for a long moment, thoughtful. Not just the place. Trace held her gaze. I know. They ate the last of the dried berries she'd saved, sitting close enough their shoulders brushed. This time she didn't pull away. When they finished, Tiva knelt by the water, washing her face and arms. Trace, out of habit, scanned the surroundings. But his posture was more at ease now, as if he finally allowed himself to believe the danger no longer breathed down their necks. Tiva stood and looked at him directly. We could stay in this hollow. There's water. The land provides food. No one comes here, unless they know exactly where to look. Trace looked over the place, the rock sheltering from one side, the thick brush closing the other, the pond catching the morning light. A quiet place, he said. A place without eyes, without threats. A good place to live. Tiva took a deep breath. The tension she'd carried since they met loosened a little more. You want that? Trace stepped closer. Yes, I want it. Tiva looked down for a moment, overwhelmed by the simplicity of his answer. She wasn't used to simple. She was used to fleeing, to explaining, to defending every step. She looked up again. This time, steady. The first night, I asked you to be my husband. I was scared. I needed someone. You weren't wrong, Trace replied. We both needed someone. She nodded. But this time, I ask again. Not out of fear, but by choice. Trace's chest tightened, not with anxiety, but with the steady weight of something real, something earned step by step. He stepped forward until only a hand's width separated them. I choose you too, he said. If you want me as your husband, then that's who I'll be. Tiva didn't answer right away. She took one step closer, placed her palm flat on his chest, right over his heartbeat. Her fingers pressed gently, as if to confirm that his words were true. That night, the fire crackled gently between them, sending long flickers of light across the curved walls of their shelter. Tiva Mooneye sat cross-legged near the flames, her hands busied with threading thin strands of sinew through the edge of a new hide covering. Trace Morvan leaned back against a smooth stone, whittling the handle of a cooking stick, his knife making even, slow shavings. Outside, the wind brushed through the hollow like a whisper. Harmless now, the kind of sound that carried peace, not warning. Tomorrow, Tiva murmured, not looking up. I walk east, near river. Look for bitterroot and dry wood. Trace nodded. I'll fix the leak in the north wall. Maybe dig out the side so water won't pool when it rains. She smiled, quiet and approving. The kind of smile that said she trusted his hands as much as she trusted the earth under her feet. When they laid down that night, it was without words. His arm curled around her naturally. Her body settled into the shape of his like a rhythm learned over many winters. No ghosts lingered in their silence. No hunger for something left behind. Only breath, steady and slow, and the feel of each other beneath a sky so wide it held the weight of everything they no longer had to carry. At first light, Tiva rose before him. She left without sound, the way she had always moved, measured, thoughtful, part of the land. She returned with pine sap, dry grass, and wild herbs in her pouch. He had already reinforced the northern edge, and now worked on setting stones tighter around the fire ring. They shared tasks like language, even when they didn't speak much. Later that week, Trace built a rack for drying fish. She laid flat stones near the fire to smoke roots. The scent of earth and smoke mixed with new beginnings, until even the hollow itself felt different. Not just shelter now, but something rooted. On the 7th day, Trace rode out briefly to the ridge where the wind opened the valley wide. When he returned, he brought 2 carved wooden figures, one shaped like a man with a hat, the other like a woman in a soft robe. He handed the second to Tiva. She took it, studying the rough details. Her thumb brushed the edge of the carved braid down the figure's back. "She looks strong," she said softly. "She is," he replied. She placed it by the fire, beside the stone ring they had made together. "Now we are not just here. Now we are remembered." And as dusk fell over the valley again, Trace took her hand, and this time he didn't say anything. He just stood with her, quiet, grounded in a life they hadn't planned, but had chosen with everything they were. The land didn't promise safety. The sky didn't promise kindness. But the two of them, they had promised each other. And that was enough. If this story has moved you, we invite you to journey with us through more true stories of the Old West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit God placed in those who carved a path forward. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once more as we walk this untamed land. Thank you.